Hi, we continue in Genesis 18 today with the scene of Sarah laughing at the entrance of her tent at the message that she is going to what? Have pleasure, have a child? It's not clear. We'll see when we get there in just a few minutes. As we continue, we're looking on the right side of the screen just to start to see how the scene we looked at last time, the great meal that Abraham and Sarah provided for the visitors, is parallel to the little bit lesser meal that Lot will provide for them in chapter 19. But key to what I want to note here is the blue part at the bottom where the rare Hebrew word ayah for where, not the usual word for where, only 4 times in Genesis and twice in these parallel passages, completes the scene right after the meal. So just one more way that these are connected here. So we'll look at that more in just a minute as we look at our scene. In addition, as you've been seeing, I keep changing these key word things because the more I go into the passage, the more key words I see. And although Sarah isn't quite a word in the sense of a Hebrew word that means something other than the person's name, even though it does, we've talked about how it means princess, and that's important. But here it's plainly her name. But you see how many times it is in this section, and not anywhere else in the rest of these 2 chapters. So this is all about Sarah here, and she's the main character speaking, and Abraham is a side character. It's really between Yahweh and Sarah, but it's also with Abraham. And one of the things that I get out of doing this series is I've taught this passage many, many times, both in college classes and in churches and around. But in the research I did to update myself for preparing this video, I was totally transformed in my understanding of the scene. So hopefully my new understanding will help you to understand it in a new way too. So one of the nice things about this scene is it forms a nice tight chiasm. It's in the lower left side of my screen, but you can now see it color coded there. So it's framed around the question of Sarah, and then there's the B parts, that exact phrase returned in due season, your wife Sarah shall have a son, and then Sarah's internal dialogue, uh, along with the narrator's comment about it in 11 and 12 at the center. So it's a really nice little chiasm, and fits perfectly here because it's separate from the scene before where they eat and separate for the scene after where the men leave and Abraham will eventually have a conversation with God about justice. So let's put up let's just leave up the key words for now, and we'll look at this as we go in detail. So with the chiasm in mind, we start at the beginning here. They said to Abraham here, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." But there's more going on there. As Meyer notes in one of the pieces I studied for the purpose of this video here, he notes when a divine question argues that a divine question suggests a call for repentance, as it did in Genesis 3 and 4. We'll look at in a minute. And Abraham failed to tell Sarah about the impending pregnancy, hence her surprise about what Abraham is now challenged. Um, However, he answers literally rather than hearing it as a rebuke. So let me unpack that a little bit here. Back in chapter 3, we heard this. Yahweh God called to the man and said, "Where are you?" And then he, says, "I was afraid." In chapter 4, we see similarly, Yahweh said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Which is plainly a lie. He knew that he'd killed Abel, and his blood was crying out from the ground, as we hear in the next verse. So here the question comes as a potential rebuke. Where is your wife Sarah? And Abraham, like Adam and like Cain, his ancestors, answers literally, not getting that it's about a rebuke. And the question one might ask is, what has he done wrong? What is he being rebuked for? By the way, that there is just another of the hennas, behold, behold in the tent, just pointing out to the messengers, to Yahweh, whoever he thinks he's talking to, right there. But what's at stake, as Meyer notes, is the connection between chapter 17 and chapter 18. And as I was noting at the beginning in the first video of this chapter, scholars who previously separated chapter 17 from 18, with 17 being a supposed priestly author from the exilic period, and chapter 18 supposedly being a Yahwist story from some other time, traditionally earlier, much earlier, centuries earlier, but more recently, unclear exactly what time, hence scholars saying things like non-P. But whether we call it J or non-P, what it assumes is that the authors of chapter 18 don't really know what's going on in chapter 17, and they've written their stories separately. But Meyer points out how tightly these are connected, because this little scene here in 9 to 15 depends completely on what we saw in chapter 17, which is that Yahweh already told Abraham that your wife Sarah is going to bear a child in due season, but the problem is he didn't tell her, which is why she can laugh to herself in verse 12, hearing it as if for the first time. And so the chastisement we're hearing is, "Where's your wife Sarah?" as if to say, you didn't tell her. Uh, and as Meyer notes, this is important that Sarah is part of the covenant. Ishmael's not part of the covenant, but Sarah is, and the child that will come, that's being promised here to be coming next season, Isaac, obviously, is the lineage to which the covenant goes. So Sarah needs to be fully included in on this. This is no longer just private business between Abraham and Yahweh. And Abraham didn't catch that what was going on here, and so he's being chastised in this scene. So with that in mind, let's look a little more closely at the details. So here we see in verse 10, this is repeating what we saw in 17, 19, and 21, my point that I was just making, that this tight connection in the language and theme between chapter 17 and 18. And we see it again on the other side of the chiasm in verse 14. I will surely return, which is one of those double words here. Return, yes, return. So I've been trying to translate these a little more literally over here so you can see that, especially when they involve body parts or double verbs as we do here. In due season, literally at the same time next year, and the exact phrase is in verse 14 and only one other time, literally as Jinsan suggests, translated as the time when it is reviving, which is to say spring. And there are a number of elements here suggesting that the earth and springtime are fitting time to have a child, much like you see it here in the Song of Songs. And of course, the traditional, proverb like phrase that the spring times when a young man's attentions turn to love and such. Um, so in that springtime, your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance, and that's one of our connections with the inside and outside. And as many feminist scholars have noted, the tent is plainly a womb symbol, and the tent entrance is a vaginal symbol. So she's listening at the very place where the conception into her body would take place. And that's only one of the elements here that connects it with her body. And so now the narrator intervenes to give us a bit of information. And to look at that, I'd like to use a piece from Andrew Davis. Here's his article, and you can see his picture. He's just happens to have been a former colleague of mine at Seattle U. He was in the graduate school of theology and ministry there before he went to the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. And he wrote this brilliant piece in 2016, Eden Revisited, a literary and theological reading of Genesis 18, 12, and 13. And in that, he provides this little chart here you can see of these two verses. So with that chart up, I can go back over a couple of the words and you can hear what's going on here. So Abraham and Sarah were old. Zaken here literally means graybeard, and plainly Sarah is not literally a graybeard, but graybeard applies to both genders here. So they're old. But notice it's repeated three different ways. Advanced in age, literally, abayamimi here, with days. They're old with days. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Orak Kanashim here, literally the path of women, different than what we'll hear about Rachel, the way of women, that we'll see when she makes an excuse for not getting off her saddle for her father back later in the book. But plainly meaning here, she's no longer menstruating. So three aspects of their age: they're old, they've had many days, and explicitly she ceased menstruating. So in that context here, and as Jameson again notes, Sarah's reaction confirms the suspicion that Abraham did not share with her the revelation given to him in chapter 17. So multiple authors leading to that same conclusion. She laughed here, Yitzhak, but not to herself, in herself, Kara, which can mean inmost part and can mean a variety of inmost parts, but it can certainly mean womb. So while she's at the womb entrance, she's laughing in her womb, saying, not necessarily to herself at all, and plainly Yahweh hears, and Abraham hears as well. So laughing in her womb, after I have grown old, or literally worn out here, and I've translated it that way over here. So after I'm worn out like a garment, and my husband, and there's different, I'll come back to that in a minute, is also old, shall I have Edna. But the word for husband here is Adoni here, a form of like Adonai, calling Yahweh Lord or Adonai. Not the usual Ish and Isha, my man and my woman. This is my Lord. But it's used here, as Davis's chart shows, even if you can't read the Hebrew, you can see the similar letters. There's a wordplay with Edna here, and with the Edna here. uh, and as with the other words as well, as you can see in the chart. But we also have to look at Edna, because there's no question, Davis agrees that Edna is cognate with Eden. They're related words. But the question is, what does it mean? My note from Sarna here has it means abundant moisture, and that's what I've been teaching for 20-something years since I first studied Genesis in detail. But Davis notes that Sarna got that from a mistranslation from Kasuto, and it really should be abundance. And I was so put off by that in terms of my own understanding, I wrote to Andrew to ask, can't the abundance here also include water? And he said, absolutely, it can include water. It's just not limited to water. So phew, I breathed a sigh of relief there to know it certainly does include water, but his article notes it includes abundance in the sense of a fullness of pregnancy, that she in her womb will have an abundance. But she'll get there by the moisture. And certainly that's connecting with Eden, which is both an abundance, as we saw, but also an abundance that comes from moisture. So whether it's the human body or the earth, the abundance of life that springs forth is a function of the moisture that provides for that. And so many connections here between Eden and the birth of this child, Isaac, here in this scene. And so having laughed and having asked the rhetorical question, which of course she wouldn't have had to ask, maybe it's not a rhetorical question, she wouldn't have had to ask if her Lord, her husband, had told her earlier, Yahweh now says to Abraham, notice he doesn't say to Sarah, but says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? And again, you can see from Davis's chart the similarities in words here, but also the difference. And when I'd previously taught this, I thought they were radically different, that Yahweh was changing what she said and making it more polite, as many commentators have said. Some folks embarrassed by the idea that this biblical matriarch is hankering for vaginal moisture and pleasure, are embarrassed by that, even though there's no reason to think that Sarah's embarrassed by it. It's only a Christian Platonist reading that's embarrassed by that kind of bodily pleasure. The Bible's not. And so some have thought that Yahweh may be embarrassed by it, which would make no sense. Why would Yahweh be embarrassed by an aspect of bodily function that Yahweh, of course, had made? But taking it all down that line, it seems that Yahweh is changing it to make it a little more modest, to make it more on the point of what his plan was, which is childbearing, rather than her plan, which is pleasure. But as Davis notes, it's not that far apart after all, because if she's talking about having an abundance, then bearing a child is just another way of saying that she's having a pregnancy here. So it's really not necessarily as different as we might have thought. And so he's saying this to Abraham, and he's continuing to talk to Abraham here in verse 14. Is anything too difficult for Yahweh? And wonderful is plainly not the right translation. Westerman noted that decades ago, and most scholars have noted that in other situations, like in Jeremiah, it's just clearly a difficult situation that's at issue. So the rhetorical question answering obviously no, nothing is too difficult for Yahweh. At the set time, finishing the chiastic parallel to the B part here, Sarah shall have a son. So again, this is all being directed to Abraham while Sarah is listening at the tent entrance. And so we hear that earlier scholars wanting to try to defend the integrity of a matriarch, like von Rad saying a white lie, but modern scholars are saying no, it's a lie. The word denied here in the PL, Keshes here, means lied, as Grossman notes. There's no question that she's lying. She did laugh, we heard it, and she's saying she didn't. First, she was afraid, which is what often leads people to lie in Genesis or otherwise, just like they did in the garden when they asked the question, where are you? And the man, the Adam, said, I'm afraid, and lied. So the question now is he, and I've always taken this as Yahweh, but as Meyer notes, he takes it as Abraham. And quoting him below, as you can see, he is blaming himself, admitting that God is right. My wife is laughing as I did because I never told her the news I should have. And so here, if we hear it as Abraham saying, oh, yes, you did laugh, he's acknowledging his own mistake, that yes, it was right for her to laugh because it was his problem. So Yahweh talking to Abraham, asking why did Sarah laugh, is trying to get Abraham to acknowledge she laughed because I failed to carry out what I should have known was the command, even though it wasn't explicit, to share the wonderful news with Sarah that she would bear a child. Why Abraham didn't, we don't know, but hopefully the next time there's news that he will share it. But of course he won't. That'll be in chapter 22 when a darker kind of news takes place. So we complete that scene here, and now we'll have nothing more to do with Sarah, and the scene will shift radically, so radically it leads some scholars to think that this next section is inserted later, but I want to suggest it's not, that we'll see it's just like everything else, is tightly integrated and the story would not be complete without it. We'll look at that next time. See you then. Bye bye.